January 27, 2009. The United States was suffering from the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, and Timothy Geithner had just embarked on his first full day as Secretary of the Treasury. He boldly told President Obama that they still had 5 financial bombs to defuse. Lehman had exploded, but Fannie, Freddie, AIG, Citigroup, and Bank of America were still ticking and in deep trouble, and they were bigger than Lehman. The financial system as a whole was at risk of collapse. The question was how to stop it. Geithner recounts the extraordinary events in his new book, Stress Test: Reflections on Financial Crises. It is part self-deprecating memoir and part explanation of the controversial decision to bail out the banks during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. We sat down to talk about it all. Tim Geithner, welcome.
Nice to see you.
So one of the things that will surprise people about this book is to learn some of the details about you, because you're sort of one of these blank slates onto which people have projected whatever they wanted.
Some hopes and some fears.
Geithner, the self-proclaimed backstage guy, served as president of the New York Federal Reserve from 2003 to 2009 during the George W. Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama White House. Before that, Geithner worked at the Treasury Department and the IMF, and unless you count a brief stint at Henry Kissinger's consulting firm, Geithner never worked in the private sector. And yet, the rumors persisted. He was one of them, a banker. He's even been misidentified as a Goldman Sachs alum. Almost everybody thought you were a banker when you, in fact, never worked in a bank in your life. But I think what most people wouldn't know is that you were a Republican.
I was. I would say not an active political Republican, but when I came out of college at that time, I was definitely at the somewhat conservative end. Certainly on economic policy, and I guess on foreign policy issues too. I sort of was in the realist tradition of foreign policy.
And did you feel like the world changed? Did you change, or did you just go into Treasury as an impartial civil servant?
I definitely went in as a sort of a non-political civil servant, definitely. And I think mostly what happened is the American politics changed, and so much of the conservative movement moved very far to the right. And so over time, I felt more comfortable in the approach to policy that President Clinton and President Obama embraced.
You were not, you're not the star student. You weren't even particularly good at economics, though you did well. What do you think explains your trajectory, your success?
I'm sure it's inexplicable. I grew up overseas. It's an interesting way to watch your country, learn about your country, looking at it from outside. And I could see the huge effect America had in the world, mostly for good, sometimes not so much. And I wanted to have a chance to play a role in affecting the choices America made, and that's what drew me into public life. But I didn't go in, as a banker, an economist, or a lawyer, the classic ways.
He also went against convention when he interviewed for the job as Treasury Secretary. He says he urged then-Senator Obama not to choose him. His mentor, Robert Rubin, the Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, spoke to Obama. So Robert Rubin told the president that you were inarticulate. And in his job interview, the president says to you, Rubin says you're inarticulate. What do you have to say about this? And you say, he's right, and it's worse than you think.
It was. I didn't ever have high expectations that there was a way to make what was necessary understandable.
Geithner felt he did not have a reassuring presence, something the country needed from the person in charge of its finances. He was president of the New York Fed when Lehman Brothers collapsed. He was a political albatross, Geithner told Obama. There were better people for the job. While he ultimately took the job, it didn't take long for Geithner to feel conflicted. On his third full day as secretary, he was walking into his first one-on-one meeting with the president when a Democratic operative stopped him, handed him talking points, and told him he was going to denounce executive compensation to the press. And you looked at it, read it, and said, I'm not saying any of this, and threw the talking points aside. And so the president said what he was going to say, and as you say, I watched uncomfortably. Why were you uncomfortable about criticizing excessive executive compensation?
It wasn't that I was uncomfortable criticizing, and I did criticize it. But at that point, I believed that what my job was, my responsibility was, to try to get the economy growing again and to try to make sure we had a system, financial system, would allow that to happen rather than continue to crush the economy. I felt like that was my responsibility, my principal responsibility, my comparative advantage, and I wasn't going to be able to help much in trying to ease the public anger, the understandable public anger, because of the tragic damage of the crisis. And I was sitting next to the President of the United States, a very talented orator, and I felt like he would be better at doing that than me.
In the end, Geithner suggests that he was never able to make the case and lost the American public.
Do you feel like people will never understand this, that you're stuck with this image of having been the guy who bailed out the banks?
I don't know that you can ever change that perspective, because the core of what you need to do in this context is just going to be, it's going to look unfair. And how can you convince people it could have been worse? Americans had no memory of the Great Depression. It's hard to, Barney Frank said famously once, it's hard to run for office on the platform that things could have been worse. Hard to convince people. So those two things make it hard. But the reason I wrote this book is because I thought it would be fair to give people a better feel for why we made the choices we made. And they don't necessarily need to agree with us.
Up next, why Geithner and his boss, President Obama, felt that bailing out the bankers was the right thing to do.
Closed captioning brought to you by Franklin Templeton Investments.
A global leader in investment management for 60 years. Franklin Templeton Investments. Gain from our perspective.
And we are back with more of my conversation with former Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner.
So the strategy that you adopted has often been criticized. It was criticized at the time and is criticized in retrospect as bailing out Wall Street at the expense of Main Street. What do you say?
It's a common perception, and it's a completely understandable perception, because what you have to do to protect the economy, the country, the average person running a business, or just trying to keep their job in a classic financial panic, feels deeply unfair. It's completely counterintuitive. And that's because the central imperative then is to make sure you prevent the collapse of the system. You keep the lights on. Think of the banking system. We don't like to think of it this way, but think of it as the power grid. It's like a vital, essential thing. And what you saw in the Great Depression, and you saw in countries since then, is that if you let panic escalate and that fire burn too strong, it's devastating. Unemployment in the Great Depression went to 25%. Output fell by 25%. It took a decade to begin to heal the damage. So the counterintuitive thing, what feels really unfair, but what's essential in a classic panic, is you have to act incredibly aggressively to make sure you prevent that loss of savings, that damage to the power grid.
Geithner understands the outrage of the moral hazard fundamentalists, as he calls them. Some people even wanted Old Testament vengeance against the rich bankers who set the financial fire of 2008. Instead, according to some, the arsonists got bailouts, but Geithner says don't mistake this for sympathy toward the bankers.
We didn't do it because we had any interest in protecting people in Wall Street from the errors of their mistakes. We did it to make sure, because it was the only way we could protect the average person from mass unemployment.
Still, Geithner acknowledges that a conflicted Obama administration never mastered the politics, never learned to adeptly navigate the populist anger. And if the American public felt Washington was coddling Wall Street, Geithner knew he was seen as the coddler-in-chief. This perception was solidified when Geithner told the president that he didn't believe they could stop AIG from paying out $165 million in bonuses after the government had rescued the insurance giant from bankruptcy.
Somebody like Elizabeth Warren says that if you look at the Great Depression, FDR was much tougher on the banks and much tougher on creditors in general, that you guys were, even within the understanding that you had to save the financial system, you could have been tougher on the banks.
I have a lot of respect for her, and I've listened to that perspective, but I think it's a deeply mistaken perspective on what it takes in a crisis. And you wouldn't want to go back and look at the Great Depression and try to replicate that outcome for the average person. What we did is try to make sure we put as much financial force directly into the American economy to offset the collapse in demand, tax cuts, unemployment benefits. The scale of that assistance we did was larger than what Roosevelt did in relative terms, to the great credit of the president and the people who supported that in the Congress. That was massive in its overall capacity. Now, ultimately, we would have liked it to have been longer, sustained longer and larger, but at the beginning it was larger than what Roosevelt did in relative terms, for exactly the reasons anyone would want.
Larger than what FDR did, but large enough? Geithner writes in Stress Test that it sometimes felt like they were fighting World War III with General Washington's army. And yet, Geithner says, the United States is almost on the road to recovery.
I think it's a much stronger economy today, even than it was in the years before the crisis, because that was a kind of a bubbly, frothy economy at that point. And I think in many ways the basic productive capacity, dynamism of the American economy, our great strengths, are intact and very strong today.
So critics would argue that would say that this is the weakest recovery since the Great Depression, so in 60 or 70 years. That much of that weakness has to do, the Wall Street Journal editorializes often, because of all the burdens that the Obama administration has put on it. Regulatory burdens from Obamacare, from Dodd-Frank's, the re-regulation of the financial industry. What do you say to them?
We've definitely brought some substantial changes to the economics of the financial system, and those were disruptive, and they definitely changed the economics of it, but that was a necessary, just thing to do. And if you look at the American economy today, you're going to see a gradually strengthening economy, and we should see not just unemployment fall further, but we should see income growth improve for a broader fraction of Americans. And that's, again, I believe, because we adopted a dramatically different strategy to our crisis than had been the pattern of governments really across decades and decades.
As for his own legacy, that will likely be judged on how the new post-crisis system, the one he helped create, withstands the next crisis. For now, Geithner, who left public office in 2013, is president of Warburg Pincus, a private equity firm. As to what his future holds beyond that, well, he's pretty clear on what he doesn't want to do.
You're out of the spotlight. If the Fed job came up 6 years from now, would you take it?
Oh, I think I've had my time in public life. I mean, I used to tell the president this, we're a nation of 300 people. I've like
300 million.
300 million people, excuse me, 300 million people. And I've had like more than my share of consequential jobs in public life.
Tim Geithner, pleasure to have you on.
Nice to see you.
The American economy may not be completely out of the woods yet, but keep in mind that the United States financial system has recovered better than Europe's, for instance. Unemployment in the Eurozone still hovers around 12%. That's higher than at the peak of the American recession. As for that unpopular federal bailout, it turns out that U.S. taxpayers have actually made a $30 billion profit, according to a ProPublica estimate. Geithner has suffered some political damage, but billionaire investor Warren Buffett calls him one of the heroes of the economic Pearl Harbor that was the financial crisis. Next on GPS, have you ever wanted to erase parts of your past? Well, a court in Europe has just granted permission for people to do just that, to the delight of some and the horror of others. I'll explain.